Welcome to Sales for Nerds. I'm your host and chief nerd, Reuben. If you started a business because you love serving clients but realized you didn't like the sales and marketing aspect of running that business so much, this is the podcast for you. Sales and marketing doesn't have to suck. It can actually be a lot of fun. And on this show, we're going to teach you how to connect instead of network, teach instead of market, help instead of sell, so you can keep serving people even while you're building your pipeline and growing your business. Now let's get to it. Today, I'm super excited to have with me Richard White. He is the founder and CEO of Fathom. And if you have not used Fathom yet, Fathom.video, this is one of the tools that I use every day. I use Mimiran, I use Superhuman, I use Zoom, and I have Fathom plugged into Zoom. It lets me take notes. And those of you who know a lot about me know that I'm always talking about how you need to take good notes because we can't count on ourselves to remember everything. And what I love about Fathom is it takes better notes than I can ever take. It lets me search them, highlight them, and do a bunch of other stuff. So I've never had a tool person come on the podcast before, but this is something that I literally use every day, multiple times a day. I copy and paste the Fathom transcript notes into Mimiran, so I have a record of what everybody said, and I love it. And so I'm so happy to have with me here today, Richard White of Fathom. Richard, what do you have in your glass?
I got Oktoberfest athletic beer. Yeah, so full disclosure, it's a non-alcoholic beer, but I've been on a non-alcoholic kick, but it's pretty delicious.
So, and, I'm hearing that the non-alcoholic beers are getting better and better, and I need to give them a shot. Richard and I talked about this interview a couple of weeks ago, and he disclosed that he is doing some clean living right now, which is more than I can say, but good for him. I'm drinking some Brave Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, some nice, fairly light, tasty Pinot Noir. So Richard, cheers. Thanks for joining me. And
thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about what Fathom is for those of us who haven't experienced it, who haven't been in a Zoom meeting with me and said, "Hey, Reuben, what the heck is this AI note taker in our meeting?"
Yeah, I mean, I think your intro did a fantastic job of kind of explaining the value prop. I was like you, right? Like I think like a lot of folks on a lot of Zoom calls, I was taking a lot of notes. I would go back to I was pretty meticulous. I think I'm actually a pretty good note taker, right? Like, I write up a few notes, I like subtract some things while I'm talking after the call, I like clean that up, make it intelligible. And I would spend a lot of time doing this process. Two things I noticed. One is I would go back to those notes 2 weeks later and be like, I don't remember which call this was, right? And more importantly, I would try to like relay some of these things I heard to my team, and just a lot of things got lost in translation, right? Someone's excited about something, someone's frustrated with something, and I'm trying to kind of play a game of telephone where I explain to them what happened. And so Fathom was kind of a reaction to that, like, and kind of scratching my own itch, if you will. It's basically a free app. It's a Zoom app and a desktop app. When you ask it to, it'll join your Zoom meeting. It will record that meeting. It will, in real time, transcribe that meeting. And it also give you a handy way to say, I just heard this moment. Reuben just said this thing. And that's an interesting insight. I want to like tag that part of the meeting. And so that part's optional, but it's kind of nice. What we notice is that like, I still want to flag, I've got 30-minute call. Usually the entire 30 minutes aren't noteworthy. And in fact, our stats show it's 15% of meetings we find to be noteworthy or dealing with customers. And so just an easy way to like flag that part's interesting, that part's interesting. So right after the call, then about 5 seconds of call being over, you have all of that information. You got the full video, the full audio, the full transcript, and you get all these highlights of that you kind of selected. We can automatically, give you kind of a summary that you can, like you said, copy and paste wherever you want, sort of thing. So that's kind of the product in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think that highlighting piece is really important. One of the things that I try to do when I'm taking notes is, like you say, not every word, not every phrase is equally important. When somebody's like, "Hey, the real problem I'm trying to solve is blah," I want to make sure I understand exactly what they described. When they say something like, "What I'm really looking to do is blah," I want to know and be able to go back to really easily, like, what exactly are they looking to do? Like, what words specifically did they use? And I think, like you, I tried to be a really meticulous note taker. I started out with notebooks. I still have a notebook. And the problem I had, and you guys on this call can probably appreciate this, if your handwriting is as atrocious as mine, I literally can't read my freaking notes when I try to go back 3 months later. So it's like, first of all, I have to index them, and I try to like say, oh, page 162 is Richard on October 10th, but then I forget to do that. And then I'm like flipping back and trying to find exactly what somebody said. And then I can't read it even if I can find it. So when I'm trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to put in the proposal, or who do I need to introduce this person to, right? The critical questions, I'm like, we had this conversation and I didn't note it correctly. So I've gotten a lot better with like doing this in text, like right on the computer, and then dumping it in the CRM where I can search it. But what Fathom does is take this to a whole new level where you can have a transcript and then, like you say, flag, like when somebody says, what I really want to do is blah, like I have a thing where I just press that button and lo and behold, I've got it.
Yep. And I can take that 30-second clip and send it off to someone else on my team. Be like, look at this example of someone being frustrated with this or excited about this. And yeah, it's funny. It's completely changed. Like I actually used to love doing in-person meetings. And now I'm like, can we actually do this on Zoom? Because I don't have a good workflow for in-person meetings. And it's so, when I do in-person meetings now, I'm stressed out. I'm like, oh my gosh, if I'm going to forget half of this or more. Right. And Fathom kind of like, a lot of times like, oh, I didn't really catch exactly what they said, but I'm not going to ask them to repeat it. I'll just go back and watch it later, sort of thing. Because I think it's natural. We kind of, our minds drift from time to time on these calls, and then something happens. You're like, oh my gosh, what just happened? And do I want to embarrass myself by asking the customer to repeat themselves? Or just like, oh great, I'll watch that afterwards and figure it out, sort of thing. So it's, I think that was the unintended side effect of this product, is just making it so it's less stressful to be on back-to-back calls all day that all kind of blur together in your brain at 5 o'clock.
Yeah, amen to that. And I think something else that when Zoom sort of came on the scene, I was like, great, you can do a meeting and you can have it recorded and you can go back and you can, in theory, figure out what did that person say at that critical juncture that I didn't know quite right, because the thing they said earlier, I was still trying to write that down. Like that's the thing that happens to me when I'm in my best zone, right? Like I'm not even zoning out because it's my 7th Zoom call of the day. It's like I'm still paying attention, but I didn't quite catch that thing. And then you have like a 500 megabyte file of an hour-long Zoom conversation, and it's somewhere like 2/3 of the way in, but trying to find it is a freaking nightmare. And so I'm sounding like an advert here, and I want to because I love this product. But it's like, instead, first of all, I can actually go search the transcript, and it's not perfect, but it's like generally good enough. And then I can zoom right to that place. Oops, I just used a Zoom pun. This is terrible. And then I can read, if I need to, I can either read the transcript and say, oh, that's what he said, or I can rewatch just that one segment without having to like go through the whole, 20-minute stretch that I wasn't exactly sure where it was.
Yeah, skipping around between like, where is this? And here, I think it was after this. Like, that's not funny there. We had an earlier version and we saw that sort of stuff. So like giving the way to annotate while you're on the call, or at least allow you to search and get quick access to it post-call. 100%.
Yeah. And then one of the big things, of course, at the end of the meeting, people are like, okay, we're going to do blah, 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 blah. And so I realized that in my use case, probably like 80% of what I'm doing when I look at the Fathom notes is I'm jumping to the end of the meeting to make sure I capture the next steps appropriately.
Yep. Yeah. People ask me like, what is your best practices for using this? And I was like, I mean, sometimes I still write notes off the call because some system requires me to, but honestly, generally, when I get on a follow-up call, I go back and just rewatch the highlights in the last 3 minutes of the previous call. And then it just kicks up it's a mnemonic, or kicks up all the memories I had in my brain. I'm also like, oh my gosh, I feel like that call just ended. I really remember it. I can go in that next conversation sounding really smart, that like not sounding like someone who completely forgot everything about this conversation in the intervening 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think that's a really big deal, because there's a lot of information that is communicated with the emotion of the video that you don't get even from the transcript. And because I'm a fairly OCD note taker, people compliment me. 1, you followed up. 2, you remember that I went to Alaska last month or whatever. But being able to, like, in a reasonable amount of time, access not just the words, but the actual sound and their body language on Zoom, it's tremendous.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fun product to build, because again, I love hearing reactions like this. It's kind of like it's very validating, because again, I think we've all run into this similar problem around note taking.
So let's actually go back for folks who aren't familiar with the product and your story. You sort of have this chain of building companies to solve the problem you experienced at your last company. Is that right?
Yeah. I think it's a very lazy way of solving your own problems. Like, oh, I have a new, biggest problem in my life. I guess I should go start a company to fix it, sort of thing.
I'm not sure lazy is the word I'd use to describe that, but yeah, there's definitely some kind of word.
Well, I always idolize some of these entrepreneurs that are like, oh, I've identified an inefficiency in the shipping container market, right? Or in the local fisheries. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I just solve problems that are like right in front of my face, sort of thing.
Right.
So yeah.
I'm right there with you. So let's go back and start that chain real quick. We don't have to get in deep, but I think it would be interesting for people to hear, because before you did Fathom, you worked on another company that was a response to a previous company.
Yep. Yeah. Before Fathom, I started this company called User Voice, and User Voice was basically a platform for gathering product feedback at very large scale. You could think of it almost as like a Reddit for customer feedback. And that came from the previous startup I worked at. We had a lot more user feedback than we knew what to do with. And that company was started in the same room as the founding of Reddit. And so like, I basically was like, oh, I can use like Reddit style things to organize product feedback. And then I can spend way less time reading much emails about product feedback. I just have delivered a list of here's my top 10 answers. And that company, User Voice, ran that for like about 12 years. And then near the end of User Voice was doing a lot of Zoom calls, doing a lot of customer calls, trying to wrap my head around some new product opportunities. And I was like, okay, we're on to some of these product opportunities, but my gosh, this note-taking thing is a disaster. And that's what kind of led to the beginnings of Fathom as well. So yeah, it's kind of a nice little way to like de-risk what you're working on. It's like, well, worst case scenario, I've solved my own problem. And so the only thing that can go wrong is if there's not enough of me in the world, it's going to be a very lonely product. But thankfully, in both cases, there's a lot of people that had those problems.
Yeah, and it's funny because sometimes we think we must be this weirdo to have these problems, because why isn't there a solution already? There's like a million apps for cat videos or whatever, but not one for dealing with the notes the way I want to deal with them in Zoom. Or for me, there's a million CRMs, but not the one that thinks the way I think or whatever. And I think you're right. Like, unless you really are like off the spectrum in some weird way,
yeah,
like there's 8 billion people on the planet. Chances are you're not the first one who's encountered this problem, but there's a chance you might be the first person who can solve it.
Yep.
Which is really kind of fun.
Yeah. Very gratifying.
Now, okay, I'm going to try to get off the infomercial.
Okay.
Though, like I said, big fan. I should have been wearing I have like a Fathom t-shirt and hat somewhere. I should have been wearing that for this interview. I just realized.
Full infomercial.
Yeah. But tell people whether or not they're using Fathom, what are some of the best practices that they should be thinking about for actually taking notes? Because I think this is one of those things that's like, this determines so much in life, from like high school through to forever. And nobody learns how to do it the quote unquote right way. You just kind of figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's one of those things where, and there are at the edges a lot of people that have very specific frameworks for how to take notes, right? But I think it's kind of like, I think I was on one podcast and they were like, what's a book you recommend everyone read? And I was like, honestly, I'd rather just recommend that everyone just have a system where you end up reading a book. I don't really care. It doesn't really matter which one you read. I think note-taking is kind of the same way. It's like, I think you can get very obsessed with like what note-taking framework to use, when the real like 80% solution is just having some sort of system that works for you, right? Mm-hmm. There's some people that like to do I like scratch up some things in real time and then I batch do all my note taking at the end of the day. There's some people that like will do it, like I put a block in my calendar 10 minutes after every meeting to like write down my takeaway notes. Like, there's all sorts of different, I think, processes to that. I think the main thing is like make sure you find a process that works for you. For me, prior to Fathom, it was the latter, right? I had to block out time. I would book a 20-minute research call and a 10-minute note-taking session right afterwards, because my mind has a very small memory bank apparently, and I very quickly, as my girlfriend knows very well, like I don't remember last week at all. So I have to right after the meeting. And I think that's probably best practice for a lot of folks, is making sure after you have some sort of content you need to be taking notes on to immediately have a system. I basically just I'm a typing. My handwriting is appalling. My hand starts hurting very quickly. Yes. So I keep a Google Doc up very quickly. I tend to use a style that emphasizes size and indentation. So I would use shortcuts to make like big concepts, like big titles, smaller concepts, smaller text. I use indents to be like, this is a subset of the thing before it, right? This is all part of the same concept. And I mainly, while I'm on something live, will just try to use a word or two as a mnemonic to remind me what this thing was about. So then I go back afterwards and rewrite up those notes.
So what would be an example of that mnemonic?
Yeah, so here we might have been in the beginning here, I might have just been writing about like, oh, Reuben, I've got your whole thing, and maybe like the biggest thing takeaway might be just instant access for recordings. Indent also mentioned search, right? And I just try to come up with like, what's a single word keyword that kind of reminds me, this was this part, right, of what we were talking about. Sometimes it's like 2 or 3 words. I am what I call single threaded, meaning if I'm typing, I'm not really listening. And so I try to keep it as short as possible if I'm doing that, right? And again, that workflow is all shifted with me now for Fathom. And so now I just use this workflow when I'm in person with someone, and I actually pull out my phone and open a note stock. And basically I'm like, okay, I've got Reuben Google Doc on my phone, and I'm typing out one word, like, hey, give me a second. I write those like 3 words down that remind me. And then after the meeting, I have to go clean it up.
I think that's a really important point about the human brain, regardless of how we like to think we're so clever, like we are single threaded. Like there's one place that our true attention can be. And that's one of the big things I love about this, right? Like I'm a big believer in conversation and listening and trying to like really understand. In my mind, once someone starts talking to me about stuff, I'm like already trying to think of the solution to whatever it is instead of just listening and then like later going into the solution mode. And if I'm trying to take notes at the same time I'm doing all this, that's another thread with an interrupt and having to get back to really focusing and listening. So I have sort of these categories, like I mentioned at the beginning, like a problem statement, a solution statement, a next step, something about a decision, certain things that I really want to highlight where they're going to tell me something that I have to remember later. Yeah. And this is where it kind of ties into the CRM, right? Like if I'm going to put together a proposal for somebody, I really need to know what their problems are. And I really need to know what they're expecting to see in a solution and things like that. And so many people will be in a meeting, take a ton of notes, and I'm like, okay, what's their big problem? And like, well, it's a bunch of stuff. And so I love that I can just listen and then hit that little, and I have a specific flag, P : so I can search for that in my notes later. And I'll just hit that in the Fathom. Folks who are listening to this, you can't see this, but go to the show notes page because I'll post a little screenshot of the default Fathom little widget and the way I have it set up so that I can flag, hey, someone mentioned a problem. Let's flag that and be able to go back and refer to it later.
One thing I also noticed, so the other inspiration for Fathom was I used to run for a period of time the sales team at my last company, User Voice. And I remember I'm an engineer by trade. And so managing the sales team was a real, what's called eye-opening experience, right? It was very much fish out of water. And I remember one of the things I really struggled with was getting my team to write good notes. And part of the reason I think I struggled with this is I would have some people that would write kind of what we're describing. It's like their finished notes would be my kind of like mnemonics, right? It'd be like, oh, I just had a 30-minute call and there's a page with like 10 2-word phrases on it, which mean only something to that person, right? And on the other hand, I'd have people who give me so many notes, it's almost like a transcript itself. And I was like, how would you possibly listen to anything when you're taking this amount of notes, right? And it was interesting because it's such a personal thing, the way you take notes. And what I noticed is that, like your point, no one really teaches you how to do it. So by the time I get these folks that are in their 30s, usually, it was really hard to get people to change their workflow on this, right? It was like whatever they were used to doing is how they did it. I'd be like, hey, can you add more detail? Like it was like one of the biggest frustrations I learned is like, I can't shift anyone's note-taking style. It's like whatever, they've evolved to a thing that seems to work for them. And if I tell them I need it some other way, like probably not going to get, I'm going to get diminishing returns out of that. So that was, I think, also interesting to just realize there's a lot of, some people really want their way of listening is writing a lot. Some people it's like me, like, no, like writing is distracting. So I use very few words. So I think it's probably figure out what works best for you to a certain degree, and you try these different ways. I will say the other thing that I've done in-person meetings that's been very effective is type out a few words, or if I'm in a place where I don't feel like I can do that, or if I am, right afterwards, I do a voice memo. like after the meeting,
Yeah.
walking back and like, okay, read through those notes. Okay, so just talk to so-and-so, and I would send that off to get transcribed by a human and be like, now I had this like overly verbose set of notes that I'd have to like cut down potentially, but at least I like immediately kind of like, it was like a, it's almost like a brain dump right after the in-person meeting. That seemed to work decently well.
Right. While it's still in RAM, make sure it gets to some more durable storage to take the engineering metaphor a little too far.
I love it.
I think so. I got a bunch of questions out of that. And part of it is, as an engineer who suddenly started running a sales team, what did you have to do? What did you have to learn beyond just these people take notes in weird ways to be successful?
I think I had to learn to be less of an engineer. I mean, I think I came in and thought like, this is a process. Imagine like designing some sort of electrical system, where in the middle of the electrical system is like this component called a human that like 2/3 of the time gives the right answer and 1/3 of the time gives the wrong answer. And so I have to build all this like process around the human. And so I think when I first took over the sales team, my solution was to add, okay, there's 20 fields you need to fill out after every call to help me figure out what exactly is happening on this call, right? And very quickly realized like, you didn't really think about the human in the thing. Like that's a ton of work. And like, to what end? It's like, oh yeah, like 6 months from now, that'll help me like figure out which deals are going to win and not, like going to help us dial in kind of our like ICP. And they're like, yeah, but I need to close the deal now. So I don't really want to fill out 20 fields sort of thing. So I think I had to, learn that sales is not just this very mechanical process. Like, yes, you need frameworks and stuff like this, but you can't ask too much. Like there's already a lot of mental energy going in just to have the conversation, being engaging, eliciting, like digging out the nuggets from the user, and they don't always fit this perfect linear thing. You gotta have some flexibility in your process. And so I feel like, over engineering the solution was the first thing I learned. It's like, that's not a good solution. It's not great in any context, but certainly not one where you've got a lot of humans involved in it.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in my prior life, I was a sales and marketing consultant, and I'd look at a lot of numbers, and then people would start rolling out Salesforce and whatnot. I'd be like, great, we can actually access the sales rep's notes. This is going to be amazing because we're going to learn the context behind these numbers. And the notes were like, had conversation, met with client. And we're like, this is useless. And it was kind of like what you were saying. The VP of sales wanted to know everything. And the sales reps were like, this is irritating. And so they were sort of playing this cat and mouse game instead of how can we make it productive for everybody to have a good record of what our conversations were about.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's almost, exactly. You have competing interests, right? Where it's like the salesperson doesn't get much out of filling in all these fields in your CRM, almost nothing, right? Versus that's everything to you as the like person running the team. And so there's just like really strong tension between those two sides.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I ended up building a different CRM, right? Like there are people who they are the VP of sales, the sales rep, the marketing VP, the marketing analyst, et cetera, all in one, all in their spare time. How can we make it, like one of the things that I wanted to do was, how can we make it so you actually want to enter good notes? Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's a bunch of things you can do about like being able to access easily what you talked about, being able to search across all your notes, being able to pull the notes into the right place in the proposals. And then Fathom just takes this to a whole different level by automating and sort of like not just automating, but highlighting the appropriate points that you need to remember later. So Richard, thank you so much. If people want to find out more, where can they get Fathom?
Yeah, so Fathom.video, like I said, free app. Jump on there, install it. And if you have any feedback for me or want to talk about this topic, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm just Richard White on LinkedIn. I've got this weird kind of like bitmap looking avatar. It's not an NFT. Everyone asks me, is it an NFT? It's not an NFT. It's just back in my day, we just called 8-bit kind of emoji avatars.
It's
so you found the right person. If you see that, that's me.
Awesome, Richard. Thank you so much. And thanks for Fathom. Like I said at the beginning, this is a tool that I use every day.
Awesome. Love to hear it. Reuben, thanks so much for having me on. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening. Drop an iTunes review or a review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you've got a friend who would benefit from this episode, let them know about it. If you've got a friend who wouldn't benefit from this episode, but you just haven't talked to for a while, now's a great time to give them a call. Thanks for listening. Until next time.